Hi, my name is Michael Chikeen. The smartest people I've met have one common belief, that us silly humans really don't know much. For example, we still don't know why planes stay in the air, or how Tylenol or even gravity works. Yeah, gravity. Look it up. In today's distracted, clickbait, misinformation age, I wish we could all be less certain, more humble, and a lot more curious. Admittedly, I've been known to struggle with all three. So no more, no less, this show is my attempt to be that change. Thanks for joining me, and here we go. Hey everybody, welcome back. I'm Mike Chikeen, and today in the virtual studio, I have with me author Claire Isenthal. Claire graduated magna cum laude from Purdue University, is a former account executive at a Fortune 500 tech company, and The Rising Order is her first novel, and she's currently writing its sequel, The New Order. One literary critic said, Rising Order almost feels a little too real for comfort, and it's the debut novel of the year. Trust me, do not miss this book. And as I've mentioned on this pod before, I do have a real soft spot for people who decide to follow their dreams and keep pushing no matter how long it takes. Claire took 7 years to complete her book, so I'm excited to chat with her today about all of her fascinating research, plus how she found the will to keep getting back in her writing chair time after time. So, Claire Isenthal, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
And thanks for being here. I think I want to start kind of where the intro left off. For one, like, where did this plot come from? What magic creative gods shine down on you? And then, yeah, how did you continue for so long until you finished it?
Well, I always like to say that although it took me 7 years from kind of ideation and when I started to write it, it really, throughout that span of time, I was also living life and having 2 children who are still young, and we were in the middle of a pandemic. And it actually took me less than a year to write the story, but then it took about 7 years to actually have the hard copy in my hand and get it published. But the idea came to me because I think that the world that we live in has become increasingly more violent, and it feels as if that violence has bled into aspects of our lives that used to feel very holy and safe, whether it be a place of religious worship, whether it be a school, whether it be a movie theater, whether it be a concert. I've really grappled with why that violence has become so prevalent, and so that's where the idea of the story came from.
Okay.
Yes.
Because the writing process after a year, and then was there updates you were doing to the story, because if you're writing something that you wanted to be set in present day, did you find like after a couple of years things have changed? Did you want to either go change a plot point or a character development to make it more current?
That's a good question. I would say not too dramatically, but I was definitely very influenced by present day events that were happening. So they kind of helped, especially with the second book, they helped form that arc and where it goes. A lot of the technology that I cover in the book is surrounding cyber terrorism. And I feel like that's become extremely prevalent as well. So it was really interesting and, to be honest, easy to kind of pull from cyber attacks that were happening throughout the country. And then particularly what was happening overseas. At that time, Russia was attacking Ukraine, for example, regularly. And so I was able to do a lot of research into that and to kind of how that was happening and what they were able to, like the systems they were able to hijack and take over. So it was always a really fascinating process that I love to kind of incorporate into the writing, but make it very, like, it's a hard thing to do, to incorporate that into a fiction novel without making it too dense for readers,
Right.
And I'm not an expert. And so there's some really good books that I read too, by some amazing journalists who also weren't experts in cyber terrorism. One is This Is How the World Ends, and that was a really good. Have you heard of that one?
I have.
I love that one.
Yeah.
And
I have a good,
I've heard the author speak. She's incredible.
okay, I was going to say, I have a good friend of mine who's a former FBI, and he worked for like a cybersecurity firm that did a lot of this. And so
Yeah.
he's an like a really Midwestern American guy, but he speaks Chinese, a little Japanese, and so he's always monitoring these little cyber terrorist cells. And so every now and then, when he and I were hanging around a lot, he would just show up for lunch. He'd be like, "Do you want me to scare the shit out of you today?" And like at the beginning, I was like, "Yeah, what do you got?" But after
Yeah.
a couple of these stories, I'm like, "Not today.
I can't hear
Not
anymore.
not
I
not
can't.
not 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 today. I don't even know how you hear this stuff." So like I'd love to hear like where you started researching and what are some of the things that you discovered, and yeah, and then I'd love to get into the plot too.
I think a lot of the research that I did centered around 0-day viruses and how essentially, I think one of the most scary things that I realized during that time is how our government in particular is aware of some of the 0-day viruses, and they don't patch certain vulnerable systems um, in order to not disclose or reveal that they know that they're there, which will tip off of the hackers. So like there was
Can you
certain
first can you
yeah.
tell us exactly what 0-day viruses are?
Oh, yes, of course. So 0-day viruses are essentially a virus on a system or a computer that allows a hacker to enter the system, and it's due to a vulnerability. So like let's say for example you haven't updated your Microsoft Word, and so there's like a little hole almost that allows them to gain access to your computer because you haven't updated that
App.
application. Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's basically what allows people to enter into your system and then essentially take over it. And that I think is what really interested me during the writing process, because I realized nowadays that that's how we fight wars, and that's what does the most damage to our society is when um, certain systems that we rely on, and this happens in the book, electricity, for example, our electrical grid, when we rely on those so heavily, even Wi-Fi, if those were to be removed or no longer accessed, what would happen? And so playing around with that idea constantly and playing out those worst case scenarios was what inspired my novel, The Rising Order.
That's great. That is
Yeah.
great because it was years ago. I think I was subscribed to Scientific American Mind, and I read about solar flares. And if we happen to have any big solar flares, it could just knock out half of the planet's electricity. And so for like 3 days, it was like the middle of winter in
I
Canada
can't
at
hear
this
stuff like
point,
this.
and it was. I apologize. This was like
Yeah.
hanging out with my buddy.
Yeah, yeah.
And so when I was reading these stories, it was like I think February in Ontario. It was like -20 outside. Snow was like halfway up my window, and I just like I remember sitting in my living room thinking, what would happen if the electricity went out? I'm like, okay, I need to steal someone's van so I can go to. I had like a hatchback car at that time, and I was like, I need to go to the store, break open the window. Like I was going through all
Yeah.
these scenarios. I'm like,
Yeah.
my grandparents, they're gonna slow us down, but I got to go
Yeah.
get them. Like all of these ridiculous thoughts from reading this
Yes.
thing about solar flares. So like, yeah. So maybe let's start off with the plot of the book, and we'll kind of go from there.
Yeah. Okay, well, so The Rising Order is about a young woman who works for a mega tech company. So it's very much inspired by my own personal background. It takes place in Chicago. I lived in Chicago. When I wrote the book, I lived there for almost 10 years. And honestly, I was expecting to live there longer, but we moved back home during the pandemic to get help from my parents, and then my husband's parents live we're in the Indianapolis area now. So it takes place in Chicago. A young woman works for a big megatech computing company. She's a recruiter, and she's taken hostage at a concert by a domestic terrorist organization. And they use her to infiltrate her computing company and attack Chicago's electrical grid. So that's the elevator pitch.
I like it.
Yeah, but I know we kind of talked about this before we started recording, but it's a lot about extremism and indoctrination as well, which was something that I also explored as I started asking myself, who are these types of people who were committing these acts of violence, and what happens if you kind of pair that extremism with cyber warfare, because that to me is the biggest threat.
Hmm.
Not even necessarily foreign agents, but like domestic agents here who, don't have any sort of rule book when it comes to how you engage in war.
Right. Well, yeah, even some of the conversations I said I've had with my friend is that, well, if we know that in Russia, for example, that we have these factories of essentially internet trolls or hackers or
Yes.
all of
Mm-hmm.
the above, why can we not go in and shut these places down? And
Mm-hmm.
he says, well, it's just not that easy. Like, you can't just go over there and like it'd be very obvious who did this. And
Mm-hmm.
a bit of an equilibrium right now that no one is causing these mass attacks because it's kind of be like it's almost like the nuclear deterrent idea. Whereas if one person fires a nuke, well, then
Yes,
all of a sudden
exactly.
everyone's firing and we're all obliterated. But like the
Exactly.
electrical grid is a really really good one because there are some of these hacks that are already happening in real time where like schools in the US are being held ransom or hospitals for some of their systems that are offline because a hacker has gone in and disabled one of their essential you know yeah
Exactly.
so
Yes. And it's interesting you say that because that nuclear deterrent idea was one I learned about in college, actually. One of my political science classes, I minored in political science. And that idea always stayed with me because my professor at the time presented the idea, well, what happens, and I just said this, but like what happens if there's a group of people who's not, they don't care about that nuclear deterrent because they don't care about what happens if, okay, like I nuke your country, but then I don't nuke your country because you'll nuke mine. But there's groups of people that don't operate in that capacity because they don't care.
right.
And so that's really what prompted this organization that I created, to be, a homegrown terrorist organization.
Right. And so who did you use as the villains? Like who comprised this homegrown organization?
So this homegrown organization is called Reds, and it stands for something, but you'll have to read to find out more about that. But in this homegrown organization, all of the members operate under aliases, and the aliases are created after very dangerous and lethal predators and animals, and that's because their mantra is their mantra is to absolve their past identities and forget and sever all ties that they had to their past. And so they create these aliases to operate under moving forward. So we never find out any of their names. But the two main villains, I would say, would be Wolf, who's one of our main characters, and then his boss, essentially, who's Spider. And the book alternates point of view. So we go back and forth between Flynn, who is the woman who I mentioned, and then Wolf. And so we kind of see how their encounter and their involvement together continues to transform throughout the book.
Right. I like that. I do like books where like I read a lot of Michael Connolly, and I like
Mm-hmm.
how it'll go in between different areas. So it's moving very quickly.
Yes, exactly. So I think that's what makes a majority of people who read it tell me they read it in 48 hours because it's that much of a page
Amazing.
turner. And I wrote the book exactly how I like to read them. I get bored very easily. I have a really bad habit of reading ahead and skipping ahead. And so I wrote a book where you can't do that because you have to read the next chapter.
Right.
And I did that by creating short chapters and by also alternating the point of view because it also it gives the author and the writer a little bit more freedom to explore the world in a different way when you're not limited by one character point of view.
Right. You're not. Before I realize if I need to close this call, you're
Mm-hmm.
not one of those people that read the ending of the book first, are you?
No, do people do
My
that?
God, I've met a few in the last year, and it's completely
Really?
despicable. Like I'm joking,
No, I don't do
obviously.
that. I won't skip that far
Yeah,
ahead.
I'm being facetious, but I like even for
Yeah,
me, like even if a book's a little bit boring, like I can understand. Okay, I'm going to skip a chapter or two, but just going to the end because they want to make sure it ends okay. But I'm like, well, then what's the point of reading the rest of the book? Like,
totally. Totally. Yeah,
I
I
just found
know.
it so funny. But
I
I really like that you solved your own problem like that.
yeah,
That is really cool. And how did you make sure
yes.
that you, because when you're creating it, it's different than being on the outside judging it. So how did you make sure that,
Yeah.
like, did you have to read it through once when you were all done and then make changes, or like, how did you have your own checks and balances for that?
That's a really good question, and I think it's a really important question. I think that I personally feel very strongly about the fact that I think you, as an author can become too close to the story. It's exactly like you said. You become too close to really see and identify what the problems are because you know the characters so well, but even though it might be in your head and come through so clearly, it might not be coming through to the readers on the page. And
Right.
so at that point, I got to a point when I finished the book where I was like, I don't know what else this needs. Like, I don't know how to make this book any better. And I had just been to a writers conference, a big conference in New York City called Thriller Fest,
Cool.
which is very well known. And I met another great author there who was a speaker, and she was published. And I reached out to her and asked, and she put me in touch with one of her good friends who is also a thriller writer, and he offered to be a developmental editor for the book. And so he helped me. We made so many changes to the book after working with him.
Wow.
And an example of that is I wrote the book in first person point of view originally. So like me, you know. And he told me after reading it that the voices sounded too similar between Flynn and Wolf. And he was like, I think that we need to change the point of view to third, you know, like he, she. And I was like, absolutely not. No way.
Yeah.
And I went back and I tried to make all these changes to make the voices sound different and sent it back to him. And he was like, no, like all of these problems that we have would be solved if you would just change the point of view. And so I went back through and I ended up changing the whole thing. And so I basically rewrote it in third person.
I'm
Close.
overwhelmed thinking of you having to do that.
Yeah.
Like, how long did that take? And well, first, how long did that take?
It didn't take as long as you might think because we ended up keeping it to close third. So the biggest thing was really deciding like what do we change to like italicized thoughts? What do we keep as like just I don't know, not exposition. And so it probably took like a good few weeks. It probably took a good few weeks.
Wow. Yeah, because
Yeah.
my initial thoughts are that I don't think I have a preference versus first or third person, but when you're reading a first person account, you just get so
Yeah.
much more texture for who that person is and like their whole inner world
Agreed.
and what they're going through, and you kind of take that ride with them. So how did
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
change the dialogue that they were having in their head so the reader could still come away with the same concept in third person?
I love that description you use. Like I love how you just said texture because I think that's exactly it. And I think that's why I was so resistant to it when he said I needed to change it. Um I I think we were able to bypass that a little bit by keeping it to close third. So like you're basically in their head still and you don't have a viewpoint of anyone else other than that character. And so we were able to still be with that character. It just gave us a little bit more separation between the two. And
Huh.
I do think that was really important and I think it made the book 10 times better
Wow.
at least by doing that. And so it was a really effective tool that we were able to use to kind of keep the reader there, keep them in the character's head, but like I said, allow a little bit more separation between the two. And the reason that this also, I think, very much depends on what kind of writer you are. I'm a pretty descriptive writer. I love a lot of detail. I'm a very vivid writer. And my editor would be like, you know, a guy's not going to look at this glass and be like, this glass is, you know, the wine is this color. Like, it's not a thought it's not an organic thought.
Right.
And so for me, maybe it would be different if you were a different kind of writer, where when you're in first person, it almost has to be a little bit more trailing thought. But because I really like to be like descriptive and immersed in the scenes, there was descriptions I would use for both of the characters and their settings, and he'd be like, "This isn't how you think about like things when you're the character," and that was true. He
Wow.
was
What
absolutely
great
right.
feedback. That's
Um,
amazing.
it was really great feedback, and so I always encourage authors to enlist professional support and help who they trust, because it will do nothing but make your work better, and you will learn so much throughout the process.
That's good. Well,
So,
even I have a friend in Barcelona here who's an investigative journalist, and he's from New York. And so I had, I took him for lunch last week, and because I found a real issue with the nonfiction book I'm trying to write now. If I'm writing a story or opinion, I think I can do that pretty well. But when I'm trying to collate,
mhm,
that's the word, data into it, and in my
mhm,
research,
yeah,
I've got overwhelmed on a couple chapters, realizing how big the scope of this is and how difficult it is. And I was asking him, how does he do that? Because all you're doing is collecting data and first person
yeah,
accounts. And he goes, that's what editors are for. He goes, you do your best to get everything in there and make sure, like, it makes sense, and the point you're trying to prove in your
mhm,
thesis is moving where you want to move it. But in the end, like, that's someone else's job, and just find someone, like you just said, that you trust.
yes,
That's really good. And I felt like an elephant got up off my chest after he said that,
yes,
because I had
yes,
one chapter on one issue, like I mentioned, like the idea of crying, and this whole thing, boys can't cry, and the myth behind that.
mhm,
And it
mhm,
ballooned into, like, now I have to put it into like different sections, because there's so much really pertinent information that I feel people need to know about. But I couldn't jam it into one chapter. It would have been like a third
yeah,
of the book. And so, like, that's just hearing the, like, that little shift of how he said that, why you
mhm,
need a third person, that it's
mhm,
one thing that
mhm.
you never would have thought of, because you were so invested in that first person account.
Exactly. That's exactly it. That's exactly it. And I remember when I was really young. So I started writing when I was, like a child, and I would always come up with stories in my head and, write them down. My mom would always say, like, don't tell anyone, don't talk about it, just write it. And I kind of kept that with me as I evolved as a writer. And I actually realized that when I did start talking about it and I started enlisting help, and another example of that is working with a writers group, I found that that's what allowed this story to like really take
Yeah.
off. So I actually disagree. Like, I think you should talk about it. Um, I think you should enlist that, like, even that conversation that you had with another writer, that just goes to show, like, how it can really change your perspective in a very invaluable way, and teach you a new skill. So
Yeah, I
totally
completely
agree.
agree. I've been trying to talk about this book with so many people. And, like, even I interviewed my 26-year-old cousin about this, and how his friends see masculinity and all these things, and just these new ideas. My only problem is, like, just keeping all the data in my head, and where do I put it so I can grab it when I need it. So, like,
Yeah.
did the research that you did for the Rising Order, as you were going through it, and I want to talk about some of the interviews you did the
Mhm.
research end up changing the direction the story went, or did you have, like, the through line of the plot and the story, and how someone would, like, in the interview, you'd learn, you would just, okay, then that's how they interact in this scene.
That's a really good question. So the interviews that I did, and the interview that I'm thinking of is, so my main character who I mentioned, Wolf, as I mentioned, he's a domestic terrorist. He is a very complicated, dark, deep character who has a lot of baggage. And I actually ended up writing him in full and completion for the most part, I'm pretty sure. Maybe I wasn't all the way done writing
Hmm.
him when I had my interview with Christian Piccolini, who is an ex-neo-Nazi skinhead who has, of course, since left the organization. And he has since formed a nonprofit organization, and which he no longer runs or is in charge of. But he is very well known in the nonprofit that he created was focused on extracting extremists from their organizations and reassimilating them back into society.
Wow.
And so he has a lot of expertise on this, especially being an ex-neo-Nazi skinhead. And he has been on like featured on 60 Minutes. He's done TED Talks. He has 2 of his books of his own. He's really remarkable. And so when I interviewed him about my character, it was more so to validate my character and ensure that I was portraying him in an authentic way. And it was also to validate his relationship with Flynn as it unfolds.
Okay.
To ensure that it's realistic and to ensure that he could potentially be influenced by someone like this young woman. And so that was a really important for me to ensure that I wasn't misrepresenting this character and his experience. And I'm glad that I did have Wolf pretty much fully formed by the time I did have that interview with Christian, because it allowed me to ask better questions. You know, like I think if I hadn't thought Wolf through yet, or if I didn't know Wolf as a character yet, it would have been hard for me to have a conversation with Christian. It wouldn't have had as much direction.
Right.
But because I did, I was able to ask more questions that really ensured that I was doing it right. Does that make sense?
Yeah, you guys basically played red light, green light. Like
Exactly.
So you would
Yes.
tell him he's doing this. Does that make sense? And he'd be like, red light, green light, and tell you if it's a
Yes.
red light, why, and go for that. Because I guess like if at some point your heroine is going to have any impact on them, you want to write it that like, okay, this guy's background makes him a little bit more susceptible to this woman getting in his head to help
Exactly.
than maybe one of his,
Exactly.
Spider or someone else who just wants to
Exactly.
burn the world down.
Yes, exactly. 100%. So it's kind of like this different tug, like, this tug back to kind of reality and this other tug in the different direction. And also what was so important to me when discussing the process of indoctrination with Christian was the one thing that I did really want to understand from him, and that was a lot of that kind of like red light, green light, was what draws individuals to these types of organizations in the first place, what makes them so susceptible. And the most important thing that I was able to validate and also learn from Christian is like, it doesn't really matter what the organization wants to do or, what their mantra is, or they just care about, these men who are drawn to these organizations care about a sense of belonging, which they have not experienced from society, and which is essentially why they're so ostracized in the first place. And so that was really important for me to like really ensure that I was portraying that correctly with Wolf's background about like why it is so easy for them to be manipulated by these groups.
Right.
And and how it doesn't even really matter what they want to do. Like it just matters that they feel a sense of power and belonging from these groups.
Right. Yeah. Did he go into the background of like the recruitment and why some of these guys might be more susceptible to like is it just belonging? Is it mission? Like I'm curious. Yeah, because you mentioned this just before we started, and I think I definitely want to reach out to Christian and see if he would have a chat, because I'm pretty fascinated by that.
Yes, you should, and you should read his books. I read his book, his autobiography, which I think it's been picked up. It was picked up by Hachette. But that I made sure to read that before my interview with him too. So like not only did I interview him and ask him questions about my characters, I asked him a lot of questions about why he did certain things that he did in his book. And like I mentioned, it wasn't the mission of that individuals are usually drawn to. It's kind of that sense of belonging. It's that sense of power.
Right.
It's that environment of feeling like you're a part of something. It doesn't like the mission could be a mission about cats as long as they kind of feel this sense of acceptance.
Right.
And so that was something that was really important for me to understand. And as I developed the indoctrination process of how these young boys become these ruthless, vicious people or men when they are indoctrinated into reds.
Right. I'm trying to come
So
up with hilarious acronyms for Reds. And
I
and
know.
since they're all men, I have like something erectile dysfunction something. And so I'm still playing with the
I haven't heard that one. I haven't heard it.
with
Now I'm never going to be able to
no,
unhear
you're
it.
not. I don't know if I should say sorry or you're welcome. But but I think, and because I'm still playing with this idea for my book about boys and men, about this indoctrination
Yeah.
process. And so
I'd love to hear more about that. I'd love to hear because it's crazy how how my fiction novel really does tie in with what you're trying to achieve with your nonfiction book.
yeah, this one concept, I'm gonna fumble through it, and we'll see where it gets to. So the
Okay.
idea that, I'm not sure if you heard, there's a concept out in the world called like the man box, where like there's all these things that men are expected to be to prove themselves to be men, and they're all over the place.
Mhm.
They're ridiculous. It's impossible to even have
Mhm.
10% of what's in that box. But I
Mhm.
think, in a concept I'm starting to craft, is this idea that it's more of a man cage, because all of these
Mhm.
things you can't actually be. The only thing that you
Mhm.
actually take away from the ridiculous, uh, I guess, ridiculous ceiling that it's set for men, is that don't act like a girl and don't be gay. And so you're in this
Mhm.
cage in that you can't actually do anything else, because you're all
Mhm.
only limited by those two main things. And so
Mhm.
in teaching boys that, it's essentially like extracting the humanity from them, because if they can't have sadness or fear or vulnerability, you also can't have love and give love and receive love, because it feels either like you're acting like a girl or you're gay. And so you
Yeah.
live your whole life, and that, like, we don't turn boys into men, we shame them from boys into men. And so if you live your whole
Mhm.
life thinking that you can't do any of the things that are natural, like loving, like being
Mhm.
sensitive, like, like feeling
Mhm.
pain, then you kind
Mhm.
of don't know how to exist in the world. And then unfortunately these
Yeah.
boys, which become men, end up gravitating to people, for better or for worse, that tell them how to be men. And
Yeah.
so you end up, if you're unfortunately around nefarious people, like an Andrew Tate sort of character, then
Mhm.
you
Yeah.
start thinking like, well, fine, this person is telling me very clearly what I need to do to be a
Yeah.
man, so that's what I'm going to do. Obviously the hard part is that it's the most basic version of traditional masculinity, and it ends up hurting them a lot more, just like extremism would. But they want to feel
Yeah.
accepted, but they don't anywhere, because they really can't do the basics of their life, which is like giving love and receiving love. So that's my idea of how someone ends up with these
Mhm.
awful characters, which on the
Mhm.
extreme end is, people like the Reds organization.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, that's fascinating. I think it's such an important topic, and I'm just it's so important. It's so important, especially because I have a young son who's 4, and he's a very sensitive little guy. And my my biggest goal in life is to raise him in a way that he can feel all of those emotions and experience them and maintain that sensitivity. And because I think the world needs more of that. And I
Yeah.
think, I think you're so right how formative these concepts can be in shaping who these boys become when they do turn into men, and how it influences even their friendships,
Oh yeah.
and um, how, for example, like the relationship that I have with my friends are so different than the relationship my husband has with his friends. And I think I think it doesn't give him as much richness in his life as it gives me, for example.
Yeah, I completely agree. Through this process, I've been trying to lead from the front with my friends, and all of them have really stepped up as what their capacity allows. Telling each other we love each other
Yes.
more and being there for each other. But like, I really find it's difficult, and a lot of men, as they get older, kind of limit themselves from saying like, I'm having a real tough time right now. Like they feel
Yeah.
guilty to say like, my
Yeah.
wife and I are going through this terrible thing, because it makes them seem weak, and all of these things, where
Yeah.
like the idea is that like everyone goes through these things with relationships, and like, and that's one of the main things, like, because I would never say that like women's relationships are better than men, because I think they're totally different. And
Yes.
but one thing that male relationships are definitely missing is that, like, sometimes you really don't feel like your friends have your back because they're so
Yeah,
cut off from themselves and their friendships. So like women like use their friendships as support and strength, and kind
exactly.
of men
Yep.
become totally divorced from the closeness they have as boys. Like the friendship with boys,
Hmm.
there's interviews and studies of how emotional and verbose boys are when they're talking about their friendships, and how I would die without my friends and all of these things. And like
Hmm.
they kind of just lose that over time because of how we
Hmm.
define friendship. So eventually they just don't feel safe around men anymore. Like I didn't expect to
Yeah.
be completely kind of devastatedly sad for what we do to boys in most
Yeah.
cultures because of these things. So like I don't have any kids, but like
Yeah.
I completely understand your
Yeah.
like focus on wanting to keep that, that beauty in your son.
Yeah. Wow. I'm just sitting with everything you've said. And, I also think another big part of that is that I think for women, some of these, I think like there's certain aspects of relationships that women have that are practiced more. So for example, like we get together, we talk about everything all the time, all of our emotions, our anxieties, our fears, like, everything from like sex to, our kids to our own personal histories. And, some of my friends I've grown up with, so they've seen me grow and evolve. And and the same with my husband. He has friends who he's grown up with, but because as groups of women, I think we practice conversation and vulnerability every day, every time we're
Right.
together. And I don't think that happens as often. Like my husband, whenever he hears like all the things we talked about, he's like, oh, I never talk about that with my
Yeah,
friends.
never. Yeah.
Never. And I think it's because it's just not practice. Like I think that, to your point, because it wasn't, maybe that's because it wasn't demonstrated for them. Maybe it's because boys have been caged at such a young age where they haven't had the ability to really stretch those muscles, and so they don't even know how to use them. I don't know.
Yeah, I think there's part of it. Like I don't think there's really that many studies on this, but like I think there is a
Hmm.
slight biological component to it. Like where I think women are more conditioned for community building and things like that. But if we look how
Hmm.
boys like come out of the womb, like they're more fussy than girls. Do you know what I mean? Like they are
Hmm.
more sensitive. They need a lot of love. And unfortunately, we
Yeah.
treat a lot of boys in society like they're going to grow up into emotionally stunted men, and so it becomes this vicious circle that like if
Yeah.
they're not mirrored the same thing from their caregivers that the parents would do or teachers would do to the daughters. And these are like
Yeah.
well-intentioned parents. These aren't, I'm not talking about like really hardcore traditional masculine sort of parents. This is just like, well,
Yeah.
this is a girl, she's delicate, so we're going to teach her, treat her with love, and if she cries, we'll accept it. Or if a boy does it, we need to make him strong for the world, so we're going to deny him these feelings. Like it's yeah,
Mm.
it's really
Hmm.
messed up. And so I
It
don't know
is.
exactly, I don't think anyone knows exactly the reason why it's so, the friendships are so desperate, or
Yeah.
disparate,
Yeah.
however you want to say that word.
Yeah.
But yeah, but I think a lot of it, more than we accept, is from just socialization.
Well, I just feel like what you're doing is so important. And I'm just so grateful to you and for exploring this. And I'm so interested to see what else you learn as you continue to write it and how much it transforms. Like I know you mentioned you were 30,000 words in. So, by the time it's done.
Yeah, we'll see. I'm still hesitant that I'm going to get there, but I appreciate I
No, you
appreciate that.
have to. Are you kidding? It's such an important topic. Like we need this in the world. We need more of it, and I think it would be very well received. And my sister does a lot of my sister does a lot of writing in, like, I don't want to call it the mommy blog space, but she does a lot of writing about motherhood. And um she works very closely with writers in that motherhood community. And I think one thing that's also severely lacking, and that a lot of her writer friends have started, not a lot of them, a few of her writer friends have started to write about, and there's been a lot of demand for it, is write about teenagers and adolescents.
Hmm.
And so that's also like a really critical age where boys are kind of becoming men, but then they don't know how to become men, and they're underdeveloped, severely underdeveloped, like their brains are
Right.
underdeveloped. And so like how to ensure you kind of preserve and foster this sensitivity and goodness and love and teach them empathy and communication when they're at this kind of critical
Right.
age. I don't know. That's just me like
Yeah, well, actually,
throwing out there.
I'm gonna take
I'm not an
one
expert.
point on that before we get into how you came up with the villain, because
Yeah.
I don't want to forget that question for your book.
Yeah.
That
Yeah. Yeah.
like even your concept that you said underdeveloped, I'd like to challenge that, because
Oh, okay.
I think
Please.
in society it seems like we're using the benchmark for goodness for how girls develop. And so I would
Okay.
say that boys aren't necessarily underdeveloped; they're just developing differently. Like they're developing different skills at that time. Whereas we're
Yes.
using like the fact that if someone in a classroom is quiet and relaxed and following orders and things like that, which most girls are
Mm-hmm.
at a certain age, much before men, we're taking that
Yeah.
as the benchmark for goodness, and that's making all boys feel like they're underdeveloped, that they're not good enough, and it
Yeah.
starts this unacceptance, I'm not good enough as I am process super early. And you can tell
Yeah.
you're obviously very aware of these things, but this is just the way that we're looking at boys and girls.
We're kind of,
And if we have
yeah,
the
conditioned to think about
yeah,
it.
so we
Hmm.
have these schools that are mostly, women's are much more likely to be teachers than men, so we're going to treat all boys like they're not good enough because they're not girls, which is completely harmful to these
Yeah.
boys.
Yeah. Oh, see. I don't know. I feel like I could talk about
Yeah,
this
sorry.
for
Let
days
me
with you.
change gears here, because the idea I had, I want to ask about your plot
I have
line
so many questions for
is,
you too.
um, hey, maybe when I'm ready for beta readers, I'll reach out.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, I'd love
Um,
that.
because I really love villains
Yeah,
in
me too.
movies, and I I seem to have a penchant for loving villains that I can really like grab onto their idea, that I understand what they're doing, maybe not their tactics. And I just
Yeah.
finished watching the Batman trilogy again,
Oh,
the Nolan one, and so
the Christopher. Oh, I love
yeah, I
his.
didn't
I
even
love
mean
his
to. Like, I
Batman.
just sat down one night, and 3 days later, there goes those three movies. So,
Yeah.
the Joker one is obviously that's chaos, and why that villain is so important, because he doesn't
Yeah.
have a purpose. He just wants to see things burn. He just wants to create chaos, and he wants to play this
Yeah.
game with Batman, who he feels is the only person that is similar to him in this world. Whereas
Hmm.
Bane, a friend of mine, sorry, and you said you've seen the three films, right?
I have. I
Okay.
have. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Hmm.
Bane, his idea was that like these really rich people are living, too high off the hog. There's too much excess, and we need to take from them to start giving to the rest of the city that is essentially starving and in poverty and things like that. And
Hmm.
my friend
Hmm.
and I joked that we're like, I think Bane's the good guy in this movie. Like, why is Batman fighting the good guy here? Because
Yeah.
the idea of this of that like living in excess and having no respect for the rest of the population is a real thing that I think we deal with in real life. So I'd love to hear about
Hmm.
like how you crafted the motivation for your villain.
Well, oh my gosh, that's another great question. I love how you frame these questions. I think when writing characters, it's very important to ensure that like no villain is a villain in their own mind, you know. And
Cool.
to your point, the motivation is extremely important and is what drives that character. And so ensuring that that motivation is very pronounced and present so that, to your point, the reader knows exactly why they're doing what they're doing is really critical. And so for Wolf, um, I would say I would say his motivation throughout the whole story becomes very challenged. And that's where the friction and tension comes in for his character. And it becomes challenged by Flynn, this other character. And so even though it's a page turner, even though there's a lot of action, I would say like the whole core behind my novel is his motivation being challenged in a way. And he is very much like a Bane character where he feels very wronged by society. And so he's very motivated to right that wrong and that society is very selfish and greedy because he experienced that firsthand. He bounced around from foster home to foster home until he was essentially punted to this reform center. And so he was abandoned his whole life, or so in his mind. We continue to find out more about Wolf and more about his backstory into the second novel. And so the motivation behind the entire organization of Reds is to create a new order. So to essentially, they're what we would equate into our society like now, probably anarchists, where they want to take down the government and basically create a new order that is where power is more evenly distributed. And a lot of that is very much influenced by the corruption in the political system and, the I'm going to use your word, the disparateness, is that even a word, between classes?
I definitely can't pronounce it.
The separation between classes. And so that pretty much is his motivation, is to burn that. So like, kind of like a mixture between Joker and Bane, where he wants to watch society as it was burn to create a new order that they are the head of, and that is more quote unquote fair in their mind.
Right.
And he fully believes in it, and he fully believes that that's the best way that our society should be in this new world that they're creating, and through their own propaganda and through their own mantra.
Oh my gosh. Did you go to like a rabbit hole of like libertarian Reddit for this?
No, is that a thing?
I'm assuming it is. I
oh my gosh, no.
Because like, so I've been a part of a bunch of like masterminds for entrepreneurs and things like that. And there's a lot of guys from the US that are like very strong libertarian for this idea of like, and I think it comes from the foundation of America of like freedom and all these things. And like, obviously political corruption has something to do with it. But like, the guys on libertarian is kind of like, I don't know, Catholicism for, as to Christianity, where I think Catholics kind of like cherry pick what they like and don't like, where libertarians are kind of the same thing, where they're like, well, yeah, like we should still have like fire department and police, but like, I don't want the central bank. Like all of these conversations happen. So you have some guys on the far end who are probably along the lines of like some of your anarchists, where like, I want to get rid of the education department. I want to make sure none of this, and I want to have only Bitcoin and all of these ideas that I'm sure like if in the second book it's the same type of villains, I'm sure there's some Reddit on there that you could ask
I guarantee
these guys a question and enjoy the comments.
Yeah, 1000%. And I did do I don't remember. I mean, so obviously there's the dark web out there. And so another piece of the research that I did was basically going on to the Jolly Rogers, like anarchist cookbook. Have you heard of that?
I have, but hold on. But did you go on the dark web to get it?
No, I don't even know how to access
No,
the
me
dark
neither.
web.
That's why it was my next question.
No, that's a little too much. That's a little too far for me. But that was just like a website that anyone can access, but it basically walks you through like how to create explosives, and any type of information about there is like how to execute any sort of catastrophic damage. And I think that the goal for me doing that was to see like anyone can access this, and I'm sure I'm pinged somewhere after going on it. So, I'll have to go out on the website. I'm sure someone's watching me.
You're on a no-fly list. Yeah.
But that reminded me of that, is that kind of like rabbit hole you can kind of go down where you're like, and I mentioned that in the book, like when you have nothing to lose, people accessing this type of information is really terrifying. And as you probably heard firsthand, the people who are having the conversations in the dark web from your friend, it's truly like you can go to a really dark place when you think about what's happening out there that we don't know about.
Yeah, and I think as more people become disconnected, and there was a huge survey on friendships last year that like people just have less and less friends. And so like if you feel so alone, well then you don't care about anybody. Well then what's the point of trying to make things better when everything just seems so shitty? You're like, well, you know what? I might as well because you have nothing to really, I don't know, love.
Yep, and that's why. And that's why people are drawn to these extremist groups, is because of that exact reason. It's because there's not a sense of connection that's real and authentic. And so they find one and they find it in the wrong places.
Right. What was the hardest part about writing this book for you?
The hardest part about, I'm like laughing at the question because I feel like every new stage I get to in this process of bringing this book to life is the hardest part.
Preach.
So like the hardest part was editing the book for me when I was like rewriting and revising and editing it. And
Ugh.
I literally, you do get to a point when you want to like throw it across the room and you freaking hate it. Like I really still hate to open up this book and like, I like can't do it.
Oh.
And so because I've read it so many times, and so it's but then the hardest part was finding an agent, and then the hardest part was going on submission to the publishing houses, and then the hardest part was like publishing it, and now the hardest part is marketing and promoting it, where it's like, oh, I didn't realize that I have to be my own entrepreneur and brand manager and social media manager and because there's so many books out there. Like people have to be drawn to your voice as an author and be
Right.
drawn to your story and characters. And so I didn't foresee that,
Oh my God. Oh,
you
you know what?
know?
This makes complete sense. I don't know why I didn't know this, but I just hated to hear it because it makes because I'm like I'm just trying the fucking thing right now, and then you're like yeah,
Yeah,
editing it
totally.
is the worst. I'm like great.
Yeah. Oh. Oh, but it depends because I have people in my writers group who hate the blank page. They hate it and they love editing. They love
Right.
it because it's all there. So it really
Yeah,
does just depend,
I
I
have
think,
people that like
on
every
you.
Wednesday afternoon I met through my book coach that we all write on Zoom for an afternoon, and hearing from them has probably been the biggest boost to help me keep writing because I hear how long it takes them. I hear how
Good.
lost
Yeah.
people feel during the process. I feel like I've one
Yeah.
guy said he had to rewrite like most of it because a part of the story changed, and I was like, okay, this
Hmm.
is supposed to feel as impossible as it does. And so that
Yes.
helps me
Oh,
just
yes.
because if I would have just have tried to just write this on my own, all of that doubt would have just made me feel like it was me.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. It's such a solitary task, and you feel as if you're in your own
Yeah.
vacuum. And so, um, because of that, I think, and I know I mentioned this earlier, but my mom was like, keep it to yourself. No, like share it with other
Yeah.
people because, and you know, even sharing it with your friends is very different than finding actual
Yes.
writers because they actually are going through it themselves. And your friends can only ask you so many times how it's going. You know, they just don't understand what it's like to be in it and the challenges
Yeah.
that come with it.
Yeah, yeah. I try to even the ideas I have. I've joined a couple of men's groups online, so I can bring some of these ideas to the table and just see who reacts and who doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's been super helpful. But
Mm-hmm.
I think you're right. Like I think you can only share with your friends so much, and you're like, okay, I'll tell you when it's
Yeah.
done. I'll send you a copy or whatever.
Yeah,
So
exactly. I tell people when new authors approach me about like what's your number one recommendation, my number one recommendation is always find
right,
a writers group.
that's
Find a
so
group of
great.
people, a small group of people. Yeah, it doesn't have to be people who write the same genre. I was different ages than my writers group. I found them at a conference. It was two other people. They wrote completely different genres than myself, and I found that to be
Yes.
extremely helpful. And that's also what taught me the most about critically reviewing work and editing and the importance of that. And it also taught me what my own strengths are as a
Cool.
writer. So like areas that I was really good at, like when it came to structure and pacing, which is something that comes
Okay.
naturally to me, they kind of needed a lot more help in coaching on. And other areas that I needed a lot of help on, you know, maybe in dialogue or exposition or whatnot, they were extremely helpful in that area
Right.
for me. So
Well, that's great. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. So I didn't really,
Hmm.
obviously, I'm deep in like research stuff. So I'm reading a lot of nonfiction, but I'm going to buy it on Kindle. Right. Is it not? Tell me it's on Kindle. Yes.
My book?
Okay. Excellent.
Yes. And if you buy it today, then it's we're running a Black Friday Cyber Monday deal. So it's only $3.99 today. It's the last day that you can get it for $3.99. So you got to
I'm
do it today.
writing buy and circling it. I'm going to do it before I get up from this chair.
Hmm. Yeah, you'll love it, and I think you'll get through it really really
Okay. And
quickly.
is there, are you doing, the audiobook as well?
We are doing an audiobook, so that'll hopefully be out in hoping January, and It just depends on how long we're recording it now. And that's been a really interesting process because I was fully expecting that to be really cringy. Like I was like, oh gosh, to hear like my work, like I just, like I mentioned, but when you write the book for so long and you rewrite it and you edit it a million times, you don't want to like anything more to
Right.
do with it. But the narrator has sent me a few of the chapters and it is so good. And the narrator is
Because
so
it's one person that does
perfect
different voices,
that
right?
it's one person. Yes, we're just doing one person. And he was like it, it's made me fall in love with my writing,
Oh, that's
which I think is
amazing.
the true sign of a really good, effective narrator. And I listened to it. I'm like, oh my gosh, I wrote this? This is mine? Like that has been my
Oh God,
experience. And
how
so
satisfying was that?
um, it was so cool. It was really, really cool. Like I was like listening at first and I was like, oh, and I was like, oh my gosh, I love
Yeah,
it.
because
Oh
it's
my
also
gosh,
not
this
your
is
own
so
voice.
great.
Because I was about to ask, like,
No.
well, why didn't you record it in your own voice? But
Yes.
I totally didn't think of like, oh yeah, it's fiction. Like you need someone that is
Yeah.
like kind of no, that is an actor that can get through like all the emotion.
Yes.
And do some of these thrillers have like, since obviously you have two very different points of view from these two different characters, like darkness
Mm-hmm.
and light, like do
Mm-hmm.
some of these books have two narrators, or is that just too expensive?
Some of them do. It just depends. And I think it kind of depends on A, like you said, your budget, B, on like the notability of the book. So for example, like Daisy Jones and the Six by Tara Jenkins Reid, that has like a cast of
Wow, is that
actors.
book that good?
Um,
I
I
mean,
haven't read the book, but I watched the show and the show was so good. And people who read the book listened to it on audio and
wow.
loved it. And they use that as an example. But because of how the book is kind of written documentary style, I think it works to have a cast of characters. But I think if you don't do that right, it could be very distracting and
Okay.
disorienting. But I have heard, I haven't listened to any personally, that there are like in my book for example, because one voice is a woman and one voice is a man, like I've heard of two different
Hmm.
narrators reading that, with one a woman and one a man. So I think it just kind of
Gotcha.
depends.
Okay. And that's, is that an add-on,
Yes,
or like your
yeah.
publisher takes care of that?
That's something that I actually, my publisher's taking care of it and distributing it, but I actually found the narrator myself, which doesn't happen very often. But we had been in discussion a long time ago. I knew his wife, and he was a voice actor in LA, and she was like, "Oh, my husband should narrate your book," and I was kind of like, "Yeah."
Ha,
And I had him do a few chapters and read them, and I just fell in love with it. Like it was
that's
so good.
great.
So
Well, yeah.
but the one last thing I'll throw in there is like I didn't realize until getting to this stage of how important the narrator
Mm,
is to readers. Like I've had so many people come up to me and ask me about the audio version, and they said that they would stop reading if they didn't like the narrator. Like I didn't
yeah.
realize until now that like it matters so much, to be honest, because I don't listen to very many
Yeah.
audiobooks.
I used to listen to a lot, and I used even autobiographies. And like, if you ever listen to Trevor Noah's
Yeah.
autobiography, he crushes it because his story is
Oh.
very good. So the writing in the book's very good, but he does a lot of voices really well for other characters, like his grandmother and friends, and he's so it
Oh,
adds
that's
like
great.
this different level to it as well. So I can imagine if you have like a really terrible voice in your ear, that audiobook's
Yeah.
going in the garbage.
Yeah, and I have people who have said that they will read whatever book by a certain
Whoa.
narrator too. They're like, I don't care what book it is. Yes. So it's kind of blowing up, it sounds like, where as a writer myself, I actually don't like listening, like I mentioned, because I like having the book in front of me, and I kind of, unfortunately, reading sometimes isn't as much of an escape for me as it is a study of craft. So like I like to read things over and over again, and I kind of like to pick apart
Right.
the words. And I do listen to nonfiction on audio because I feel like that's a little bit more of a, I don't know. I just think it's less of a dissection of craft, especially because it's
Sure.
written very differently. So, but yeah, I don't
Wow.
really know where I was going
You
with
know, it's
that
very,
other
very
than to
cool
say,
because
yeah.
you want to
Hmm.
because I was going to say to end off here how much I really love your title. It's also very zeitgeisty, right? Like the Rising Order, the new
Thank
order. Like
you.
I think you'll get a lot of
Yep.
people that like fiction that maybe also like to think that they have microchips from Bill Gates in them. That'll be like, this is the book. There's secrets in this book that will tell me what's going on in the world.
Do you think
You know what?
so? Oh my gosh.
Nothing
That'd be
surprises me
cool.
anymore. So I
You're
maybe you
right.
can create like a fake account on like a Reddit site or these conspiracy sites. You'd be like, guys, this is the book. This book has all
Yeah,
the answers, and all of a sudden your
you're
sales are
so
just
right.
through the roof.
Yeah. This is
Yeah,
it,
you
Michael. This
you
is my
find a
moment.
QAnon secret
Let's
QAnon
tell
message
everyone that.
board, and you're good to go. Anyhow,
Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time. I really enjoyed this. Thanks for joining me today, and all the
Me
best
too.
with marketing your book.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me on. And it was really, really cool to see how your nonfiction, what you're working on, and your project intersected with
Yeah,
mine. And it just goes to show, I think, how that happens in life, doesn't it? I mean, with what's real and then what's not, and how much it influences it. And I think, regardless, they're important and timely themes that will hopefully change some people's
yeah.
perceptions. So,
Hope so. Thanks.
fingers
Yeah.
crossed. Thank you for having me.
So thanks for listening to No More, No Less. I appreciate the time you spent with me today. So please subscribe and rate the show if you enjoyed it. It'll help me create more amazing content and get that next little bit of validation that I so deeply crave. If you didn't enjoy it, well, that sucks. But to make sure, I think you should listen to my next 10 episodes and then decide. I mean, come on. Rome was not built in a day. I'm just getting warmed up here, guys. So thanks again. See you next time.